I'd like to welcome everybody for our second our second seminar on the Rambam, and I want to thank Professor Herman for last week's amazing presentation, and I look forward to tonight to learn more about really the changes that the Rambam has done over the years and your elucidation. Thank you.
Thank you, Marc, again for inviting me, organizing, and everyone for coming. I appreciate everyone's attendance in person and on Zoom, although the Zoom is less fun, I guess, than in person. But such is the situation, I guess, as we are today. Okay, so last time, for those of you who either need a refresher or need a little bit of catching up, I wanted to introduce you basically to the amazing findings that we have. Really, the thesis, I guess, last time, besides all the details and reconstructing the dates and figuring out what's what, one of the most important insights, I think, or one of the most important points to take away from last week was that we really have so much, right? The Rambam, we know more about the Rambam's life, daily schedule, how he produced his works than any other Rishon, right? We can assume that some of the Rishonim worked in similar ways, right? And sometimes we have certain evidence. We talked about that at the very, very end last week. But because of several factors, who the Rambam was, right? Meaning in his lifetime, he was so well respected and so well, the kavod that he was given in his day and his own standing in the Egyptian community and really in the world, the whole world, even during his lifetime, which was basically unparalleled. Save maybe the Rashba, it's a couple other unique individuals, right? Also because he just happened to live next to the most important storehouse of medieval documents in the entire world, right? Not just the, let's see if we can get the Zoom muted here, at least. Not just that he is right next, it's not just the most important, the Cairo Geniza, that is the storehouse of Jewish documents in Cairo and its environs that survive, is not just the most important source of medieval Jewish history, but the most important source of medieval history in the Islamic world, and perhaps, arguably, one of the most important pre-modern sources as a whole. Right? It gives us a lot of insight into daily life, and a lot of insight into how people lived and what they did, what they ate, how they went to school, how they fought, how they married, how they died, etc., sources that are still being mined by historians today. Right? And the Rambam happens to have lived at the time when this major set of sources was basically not being assembled because it wasn't a sort of active thing, but passively put together and came together. So because of this sort of confluence of factors, both who the Rambam was and this very lucky fact that he lived right next door to the Cairo Geniza, what we call the Cairo Geniza, right? We happen to know more about him and more about how he worked than any other medieval Jew, right? So it's very helpful for historians and really anybody who wants to know about the Rambam. So that was what I sort of wanted to come away with last week. What I want to do in the next couple classes, this week and next, is talk a little bit, about the writing process, right? And B, about how the Rambam sort of thought and changed his mind. And those two things, as we'll see, will come together, right? The question of how the Rambam produced his works can only be answered really by understanding the halakhic intricacies of those works. Right? That's what we will see tonight. What I want to show you, basically, is that if you really want to get to this question of how the Rambam thought, how he changed his mind, we can really dig down really deep into his own works, into the own copies that he held in his hand, that he probably produced in his own hand. And we can see that through the writings themselves. So that's what I want to do tonight. Tonight we're going to focus on the... let's get this working. Tonight we're going to focus on the Parisha Mishna, right? And the manuscript that we have, that the Rambam worked on and probably produced himself, of the Parisha Mishna. And next week next week we'll talk about the Sefer HaMitzvot and the Mishnah Torah, and we'll see why those two things have to go together when we get there. So let's just start quickly to remind ourselves of our dates. Of course, the Rambam we established last week was born around 1138. Oftentimes you will see the year 1135. That is based on seemingly a mistake that already was reproduced in the medieval period. Right, but the Rambam was born, as best we know, around the year 1138 in Spain. After some tumultuous time, ended up in court in Cairo, in the old city of Cairo, which is known as Fustat, in Egypt, right, really the center of Egyptian political life. right? And he arrived in Egypt in sometime in the middle 1160s, mid to early 1160s, 63, 64, 65, we don't really know, right? He finished the Parisha Mishna in 1168, right? Telling us that he worked on it for 7 years, which means he started in 1161. Then we talked about last week how we sort of get to the next 10 years of the Rambam's life when he produced the Sefer HaMitzvot. And obviously, the most important work, halakhic work that he produced, which is the Misfara, took about 10 years. The dates are a little bit fuzzy. The Rambam himself tells us it took about 10 years. What that means, it was 9 years, of 11 years, who knows? But we're talking about a process that took about 10 years. Okay.
How old is he at the time of 1168?
So how old is he? He was about 40, I guess, right? He was born in 1138. He was more or less 40, right, when he finished the Mishnah Torah, which is, for those of us under 40, is a kick in the tuchus to get working. Okay. So with the Parisha Mishna, maybe because the Rambam brought these texts themselves with him when he was traveling, and maybe because he produced them in Cairo themselves, we happen to have a number of manuscripts that survive that are not the final copy, but the draft of the Parisha Mishna. Right? We don't have a draft of the entire thing. We don't even have the final copy of the entire thing. We'll talk about that in a second. But we do have these scattered pages of drafts that show us a little bit into how the Rambam worked. Here you see a draft of the Parisha Mishna in the introduction to Tarot, which is, for anyone familiar with it, is a massive contribution. Well, this is a relatively obscure topic in the history of halakha and in the halakhic in learning, right? And this is something the Rambam's introduction really lays out the principles in a really systematic way, which only he could do. And this work, we have, lo and behold, a couple pages of the introduction. You see here just these couple lines where, for example, the Rambam changed his mind, crossed things out. Here's the back of the page. Things get a little messier. These obviously are relatively tricky to read. It takes a specialist's eye. I confess that I do not have it, and certainly not all the cases. Right? Some of these are quite difficult and require teams of experts to work through. But that's the kind of thing that survived. We have, similarly, we have drafts of the Parisha Mishna in Sanhedrin. Right? Similar story here. This is a little bit, even a little bit more fragmentary, obviously. You can see folds in the page. You can see loose sort of fragments, really, that have been reassembled from this, and it's really scattered words. Only because we have the later final copy can we tell sometimes what this said, right? And as we mentioned last week, we have this draft of the Parisha Mishna on Shabbat, right? There's a few other ones. There's Psachim that's out there. There may be a couple others that are undiscovered, right, or unidentified. There's a lot of fighting, obviously, sometimes, unfortunately, about who gets to publish this stuff. Right? All this material that you've seen now has been published starting in the 50s and 60s up until just very recently. Much of this stuff has come to light.
How do they know it's his?
How do they know it's his? That's a very good question, right? So how do we know it's his? That's an excellent question. The answer to that question is that we have here a work that looks like a work we know the Rambam wrote, right? We know the Rambam wrote a Parisha Mishna, right? We know that he wrote, obviously, on the second chapter of Shabbat, right? And this work appears to is very, very similar. This page is very similar. So your question is, how do we know that this page is similar to the work that we have, right? Is that correct?
So you mean if you actually write out the text, it is the same?
It's very, very similar to the text, right? And it's so similar, right, that it almost has to be a draft. So sort of by default, who else would write a draft of the work the Rambam wrote? Obviously the Rambam.
So it's not a handwriting thing.
Oh, we'll get there in a second. We'll get to the handwriting in a second. But also, who would dare correct the Rambam, right? We see, if you look back just in the here on the draft of Tarot, right, assuming this is something written by the Rambam, which it was, because it parallels a text we know the Rambam wrote, right? No one's going to go around crossing out words in the Rambam. Right, that's not something that someone would have done. A contemporary or even later would certainly not come across. It was someone who's held in such high esteem that you wouldn't do such a thing, right? So that's our sort of base assumption that these works. And then when we'll get to the handwriting in a second, but in terms of content, in terms of form, that's sort of the biggest argument to substantiate the claim, which is universally accepted, that these drafts belong to the Rambam himself, right? And the handwriting, we'll talk about that in a second. I think it might be on a couple slides, right? You'll see. But before we get there, right, you see here this similarly from the Parisha Mishna in Shabbat, right? This too is a remarkable work of reconstruction, right? We have here again something like a puzzle. Obviously, we have the final answer, so we sort of know what the puzzle is supposed to look like. But you can see here these are not folds; these are actual tears. These are really like independent fragments that have been pieced together by modern scholars to reconstruct this what was obviously a full page of paper at one point that we only have little pieces from that can show us these things, right? And okay, so that's sort of the first stage. It's clear anyone would do this, but certainly when it comes to Rambam, it's very nice to know that we have these drafts, right? The next thing that we have in the Parisha Mishna is what scholars like to call the fair copy. Right? That's a technical term, which basically means the copy of the author himself, right, or herself. But when we deal with pre-modern works, mostly himself, right? And what we had in the case of the Parisha Mishna, unlike, as far as I know, I don't want to say 100%, but I'm pretty sure that we don't have any other personal copies that belong to Rishonim. This might be the largest. It's certainly the largest, without doubt, copy of a medieval work that was written by a medieval Jew, meaning that it's his own copy, right? And this copy of the Parisha Mishna survives essentially on 5 of the 6 starim of the Mishnah. We don't have Taharot. We don't have his personal copy of Taharot, but we have the first 5 starim, right? And it was kept down and passed down in a family tradition that asserted that it was the Rambam's own copy of this text. Okay? And we're going to go through some of the arguments as to why scholars think this is correct. The question, how do we know that, why do we think that, right? So you're looking at the first cover page, and just to zoom in on a couple texts, right? That is the opening poem that the Rambam himself puts at the beginning of the Parisha Mishna, right? Here you see the text here just in the modern standard scholarly edition by Yosef Kafet, right? And here you see if anyone who can read Hebrew can probably make out some of the words, right? Sefer Asher Chubar Bedin Moshe, Be'er Halachotav Vedat Tzidko, right? You see as well, Sefer Asher Chubar Bedin Moshe, Be'er Halachotav Vedat Tzidko, right? That's when some of the words get cut off a little bit, right? Kadat Asher Ha'atik Zakanenu, right? Etc., etc., right? So we see this is the same text, right? This is not an argument that it belongs to the Rambam just yet, but this is the same text, clearly, of a very early copy of the Parisha Mishnah, something that should be, we know this is the Parisha Mishnah, this is the text that we have. How do we know that it belongs to the Rambam's family and his descendants? So the way we know that is essentially, the most obvious way, at least from this page, is this text right here. This is written in Judeo-Arabic, which we don't need to read aloud, but thankfully I took the translation on the first part of the first source in the handout is the translation, right? From Solomon Sassoon, who was the one who published this work in the 50s, 60s, I'm not entirely sure. You can ask me, I can double check that after, the exact date of the publication, but this text, on this very page, right below the Rambam's opening poem, right, has this note about ownership. Someone wanted read source number 1 for us, just to get us a sense as to what this might say. Who wants to dare put up their hands? Please.
This and the remaining parts are the original exemplars in the handwriting of our teacher Moshe of blessed memory. They belong to me, and I dedicated them to God. They shall not be sold nor bought, neither shall they be pledged as security, nor shall they be hidden but they shall be governed by the rule that they shall always remain under the jurisdiction of the eldest of the brothers, among the descendants, generation after generation, till our Messiah shall come, and any Israelite who shall desire to see them and to be blessed by them, or to reveal from the halacha or its accurate version, shall not refrain from doing so. For such was the intention of their author.
And so here we have a statement from the great-grandson of the Rambam. Here you see just the beginning of the family tree. Here's the Rambam, followed by his son Avraham ben Rambam, who had a major successor was David HaRambam, David Maimonides, and then this was written by Rabbi Shlomo Maimonides, right? So this we're talking about who was born 50 years after the Rambam died, right? Lived till the end of till about the year 1300, give or take. We're not really sure. So what does he say in this text? What does he tell us in this dedication?
It's authentic.
He says this is authentic, right? He is testifying. This is very early on, so we're talking at the most 100 years after the Rambam died. We have this family tradition already that it's authentic, that it belongs to the Rambam himself, right?
You wrote this on the bottom part of the page.
Yeah.
Isn't
That's very standard. That's very standard. Very, very standard. That's how people would write in.
And they left so much space at the bottom.
Yeah, people would write all sorts of things in medieval manuscripts. Who owned them? All sorts of things like this. Yeah, notes to later readers, exactly. But so the one thing he tells us is that it belongs to the Rambam. That's the first thing, right? Here you can see just in the text, right? Rabbeinu Moshe, right? That's the text, who he's referring to himself, right? What else did he tell us? What's supposed to be happening with this text?
Is it public domain that you're supposed to keep?
Essentially, right. It's some sort of like publicly accessing domain. This is supposed to be held in some sort of library or some sort of the personal home, but accessible to people in the Jewish community of. The family moved from Cairo to Syria for reasons that remain unclear. And then it would stay, and this document would stay in the family's hand, generation after generation, eldest son to eldest son. That was the idea, right? This lasted very, very nicely until about the 17th century, when this manuscript, along with a whole slew of other manuscripts, were sold to two separate British professors, academics, religious people, like religious Protestants. One, Robert Huntington II. Pocock, Alfred Pocock, I'm not sure, this first name is escaping me, right?
Sold by the descendants?
Probably, that's what it seems like. Sold by the descendants and they were held for a certain amount of time. Some of them are now in Israel, but for a certain amount of time in Oxford, right? Different volumes were sold at different times, and they each have their own story. Okay.
But at what point is the text available in some sort of printed form that was used?
When was it first printed? When was the first printing of the Parisha Mishna?
Or handwritten.
When was it first? We'll talk about that. Okay. Right, so here you see the family tree. Right, so how do we know this is the Rambam's own writings? So here, this is a very technical question, right? Obviously, it takes a certain kind of skill in paleography to distill, handwriting analysis, right? Luckily, for when it comes to the Rambam, we have a lot of examples to compare, and I just want to show you just one word and how these kind of questions are answered. Not answering this definitively, although experts have weighed in and argued fairly definitively that this text was written by the Rambam. We'll talk about that one more second. But here you just see, and I've taken 5 separate manuscripts that were all apparently written by the Rambam, and that give us a little example. First, on the top line, we have what is the Rambam's own copy of his Hilchot HaYerushalmi, which is something he wrote as a young person before the Parisha Mishna, never really completed. Essentially, it's something like a riff on the Yerushalmi. Right here, you have in the first, I've transcribed all the words here, but here you have Brachot, Perek, Aleph. Right. So I just want to focus on this word Perek and show you how it is consistent across time. Right. Then we have this a little bit later. We have the draft of Hilchot Strikethrough that we talked about a lot last week. Here we see Perek Chi'i. Right. The word Perek is written very, very similar. See the Pei and the Resh is curved, attached to the Kuf, where the final Kuf at the end of the word sort of has a foot on the bottom. You see that Kuf? Right. So too we see, if we look in the Parisha Mishna draft of Shabbat, here we see in Shabbat Perek Gimel, Kira Shehi Sikuha. Right. This is the name of the opening words of the first Perek of the Mishnah, of the third Perek of Misfara Shabbat. Just to focus again, the word Perek is written very, very similar. Obviously not identical, but pretty similar. You see the Pei with the same line, the Resh more or less attached here, in the Kuf circles around again, right? And then in the fair copy, that is the Rambam's own copy, it's cut off here. Here we see the word fi, in Arabic means in, brachot, perek, shlosha aklu, ka'achat, right? That's a familiar chapter of brachot to many people, right? Here we see a little bit of change. It's obviously in the fair copy, the Rambam is writing something a little bit fancier, right? This is not for personal consumption anymore, right? When he wrote all those drafts, he didn't expect certainly expect me to read it, didn't expect any of his contemporaries to read it, right? That was something he wrote for himself, for which would then be published, whatever that means, when we're dealing with medieval writings where things are hand copied, but essentially been given access to people to copy, right? So here we have the word perek again, right? And then you see just a random entry of the beginning of a chapter, Perek Shlishi, where the Rambam is writing chapter headings. He does it in much bigger, right? So obviously when he's writing things, they're fancier, they look different. It's a little bit more legible to plebs like you and me, right?
Print and script, right?
Similar. It's not the same kind, not exactly the same distinction, but yes, it's similar kind of distinction. The Rambam himself talks about similar distinctions. Yeah.
Have we lost something in the fact that there's no such thing as a manuscript where someone goes like
Sure.
this anymore?
Yeah.
We just erase and we don't know what they said.
Yeah, we lose it. Yeah, absolutely. But we'll see the Rambam is going to erase as well. We'll see the Rambam is as well. Okay. When writing the Parisha Mishna, then we have a draft, right, with all these corrections. Obviously, the Rambam wrote a draft. Anyone would have written a draft. And I just want to show you the kind of changes, some of the changes that we can see in the Rambam's own copy. So here is just a random picture from the draft of the Parisha Mishna on Shabbat, right? This is it's something related to the halachot of Eruv, right? I think it's a chatzer, right? Some sort of courtyard, right? And here you see, sorry, we'll get to that picture. Here you see the picture is sort of rough, right? The lines are not entirely straight. It's sort of the kind of thing one would write without a ruler. The letters are sort of unclear. But here you see when you go to the Parisha Mishna in Kilayim, just to show you by way of contrast, the way the Rambam is drawing out the fields that are discussed at great length is in these Mishnayot, right? They are no longer just mere rough, right? Clearly the Rambam is using some sort of straight edge device to make the lines incredibly straight. That these are, if you look here, that you can see the pattern of the dimensions of the fields, right? They're all sort of exactly measured very, very carefully, right? This is a much more advanced picture drawing ability, right, that the Rambam brought to bear when he was doing the fair copy than when he was just writing for himself, as one would expect. Right? But just to show you the kind of things that we have, and obviously most famously of these drawings is the drawing of the menorah, right, in the Parisha Mishna Menachot, right? This has become made famous by Chabad in the 20th century, right? This very stringent demand on straight arms for the menorah, right? For Hanukkah, but here for the Rambam in the menorah of the Mikdash, that's only 7, right? But you can see here a similar idea. The Rambam's very careful about how to draw shapes, right? And he's filling them in. It's a sort of beautiful, perfect sort of geometric patterns that you see in this change. And that I'm just showing you as a change, the kind of change the Rambam made from the draft to the fair copy when he was doing it something of the sort of the final copy. But of course, we're not just interested in the final copy. The Rambam also edited his works, right? The final copy was never quite so final, right? So what I think is another interesting question is how did we get from the fair copy, which was obviously sometime beautifully handwritten, to the kind of changes that the Rambam made here. And here we have our insight as students of Torah in a more traditional sense are going to help us a lot figuring out how the Rambam changed his mind. And so here you can see, this is the most starkly drawn page, but here you can see the Parisha Mishna and Shvi'it. We'll talk about the content in a second. But just let's see, even without knowing the content, what is going on here. Right? So obviously it's not hard to figure out that at some point this page did not have all these crossouts. Right? No one writes like this. So clearly the Rambam had some idea in his mind of what he thought, right? And wrote this page without, clearly like every other page. Right? And then, slowly, the Rambam began to make certain changes. Right? The first one here, and this is an example of changing one word. Right? This is a very slight, subtle change in the Arabic word that is typical of the way the Rambam edited the Parisha Mishna, not by making major changes, by making very small changes. And this change is part of a larger class of changes, of very small word changes that are basically meaningless. He's just changing from a lower level sort of spoken dialect to a fancier word in the Arabic language. He does this all the time. And it's fascinating to think about why the Rambam would have made these sort of just linguistic improvements in the Parisha Mishna, but he did such a thing. Right? And here, then, after making that, or at some point, when he made this linguistic change, he tried to make another change into this text, right? Just writing on the side, right? Before, presumably, he crossed out this whole thing, right? He wanted to add in a little bit to show us what is going on with this text and to show us that he is offering a different view, right? And then, and only then, did he say, forget it, I'm going to throw out this whole page. So what we have here is not different additions. Sometimes you'll see certain scholars, even Kafetz makes this formulation to talk about different editions of the Parisha Mishna. We don't have additions in the sense of a full rewriting. What we have is different stages of particular texts, right? And this text underwent 2, 3, at least 3, maybe more stages of editing within the Rambam's own thinking. So this is obviously a very technical passage. What I want to show you is just content-wise why the Rambam changed his mind. So let's start with the let's turn it now to source number 2. This is the Mishnah in Shvi'it, the one that's cited on the slide, chapter 10, Mishnah 5. Someone want to read this maybe in Hebrew just to give us a little bit of sense of the ambiguity here? Right, so the Mishnah tells us a mukdam prosbul is permitted, is kasher, is valid, I guess, and a mu'uchar one is pasul. So obviously the question that we have to ask ourselves when we're reading this Mishnah, when the Rambam read this Mishnah, he asked this question. When we read this Mishnah, we have to ask this question. Well, we know what a prosbul is. We know what the words kasher and pasul mean. What does the word mukdam and mu'uchar mean? So there are 2 possible translations of these words. If you want to cheat, they're in English, but what would they be? What's the 2 possible translations of the word mukdam? Earlier, or early and later, or the other translations of mukdam and mu'uchar are predated and postdated, right? When you're dealing with a legal document, which a prosbul is, right, you can write the date that's different than the date that you're actually writing the document, right? This is I'm not a lawyer, but I assume lawyers have to deal with this problem, right? Or you're writing a check, right? I would write a check for the end of the month, right? You could write it any day and date it for any month. So you can predate or postdate any legal document, right? So a prosbul, so too, can be predated or postdated. So, lo and behold,
Well before Shemitah.
yes, yeah, we're dealing with well before
That's what
Shemitah.
you meant by predated.
We'll see. No, it's not before Shemitah. It's when the prosbul is going to come into effect. Right? Obviously, it has to be before Shemitah, but when before Shemitah is it going to come into effect? Right? Right? You just need it to become effective before Shemitah starts, but it could be a month before Shemitah, a year before Shemitah, whatever you want. Right? So, lo and behold, this question of whether the word mukdam muchar means early, late, or predated, postdated, is the very issue that the Rambam dealt with. So if you look in the first draft, which is the text the Rambam crossed out, obviously this is not the entire text that crossed out. We could spend the entire night on this one page. It's pretty technical. It probably wouldn't make for give us much serve our larger goals, but it's certainly valuable to read if you get the time. If you look at the first draft of the Parisha Mishna, where the Rambam crossed out, someone want to read this text? I guess we're going to read this in English. Source number 3.
Early prosbul is when one writes the prosbul first and then loans the money. Likewise, when one loans the money, creates a debt, and then writes the prosbul. This is invalid because the loan has been created and the rules of the loan enacted.
So what does the Rambam allow here? You need here in this case? You need the prosbul before the loan has been made, right? If I'm loaning someone money and I know that, and I expect the loan to continue into Shemitah, and I want to make sure that my loan is going to be paid back and still be valid, right? I can still press for the money, right? Then I have to write the prosbul first. That's what the Rambam's first interpretation of this Mishnah was. But if you look in the final draft, which is of the Parisha Mishna, we have a different interpretation of these phrases. Who wants to read source number 4 for us?
The predated prosbul is when one writes a prosbul and gives it an earlier date. A postdated one is when one writes it today and gives it a later date.
Right. So here we have a very clear change of interpretation. Does the word mukdam and muchar mean early, like before the loan, after the loan, or does it mean before the time you're standing? Am I predating this document or am I postdating this document? Right? That's clearly the change that's going on in interpreting this Mishnah. And if we look in the Mishnah Torah in Hilchot Shemitah V'Yovel Perek Tet, right, in source number 5, we have the Rambam repeating this very ruling, the one that he changed his mind to, which is not at all surprising, right? If he is changing the Parisha Mishna so, if you will, violently, right? He's clearly doing so. He's probably going to rule that way in the Mishnah Torah. We don't have a lot of examples of. I actually can't think of any example where the Rambam edited the Parisha Mishna and then would later disagree with the Mishnah Torah. There may be examples, but as far as I know, right, or certainly generally speaking, in almost every case, if there's a change to the Parisha Mishna, it's going to reflect the later view of the Rambam as it's found in Mishnah Torah, which was written in the following decade, right? And that's what he says in source number 9. Right? He presents this view, exactly what I have to read inside, just so you can read it yourself, just to know that the Rambam repeats the view that mukdam muchar means predated, postdated, not early, late. Right? Just the view that he has now changed his mind to when he's writing the Parisha Mishna. And lo and behold, the Rambam was actually asked about this. Okay.
I understand this, but in principle you write, even if you made a loan 6 years ago, so there's no concept of predating and post-dating for a proof. I don't understand what that means.
What do you mean? Sorry, I was...
You have loans, right? You have 100 loans out there made over the last 6 years. You write it, I think we write at the end of Shemitah, you write at the end of Shemitah. So the loans were written all 6 years prior, so I don't know what the Rambam is even saying.
The question, but the prosbul is different than the loan itself, right? You have to...
No, first of all, just assigns it to Bezdin.
Right, but he's saying that the prosbul has to be written before the loan. That's what...
We don't pass it that way.
Sure, okay.
I mean, it makes no sense because then the prosbul is almost ineffective because every loan you have to have a prosbul with it.
I confess to you that I did not follow up in the Shulchan Aruch how we, why we just...
It makes no sense. In Menega, what do you mean? So you make 10 loans, everyone has to have a prosbul attached to the loan?
I guess so. That's what the Rambam's view is, apparently.
The Parisha Mishna was in Hebrew?
No, it's in Arabic.
The Misfara is Hebrew.
Correct.
So we're comparing Arabic. It's a translation.
The Arabic is the translation, right. And in fact, when you look at, we have very similar examples here, right, in these kind of documents where the Rambam is making similar changes, right? This one has to do again with Shvi'it. Don't ask me why there's so many changes in the Parisha Mishna and Shvi'it. I'm not really sure, but this is rather substantive as well, right? What we have, has to do with Sfichim. We're not going to go into the details. The Rambam has changed his mind a number of times about Sfichin, that is sort of like the small growths that happen during Shvi'it. So there's a question of the status of those growths. Right here, the Rambam is changing his mind. But this, I'm just showing this to you to show you the next couple of slides. If we look in these Tshuvot, right, from the Rambam, here you see the original to the Arabic from an important manuscript, not from the Rambam himself, but a later copy, about these very questions. So this here, source number 6, is dealing with this question of prosbul, and then we'll get to the shaila about Shvi'it. Right? Here we have just reflecting, showing the Rambam telling us what he would do in these kinds of questions. Who wants to read source number 6? As far as I know, we don't know who the questioner here is. There's a question asked to the Rambam, page, I guess it's the top of page 2 on the sources.
Question.
Yeah.
Can you instruct us regarding the early and late prosbul? We saw in your view in the Chibur and the opposite in the Parisha Mishna.
Okay, so what is this telling us? Right? This question then was written before the Parisha Mishna was fixed, or at least before the questioner had access to it. Right? The Parisha Mishna circulated in the copy that was not crossed out, and then later the Chibur, that is the Mishnah Torah, went out into the world. Right? And people said, wait a second, I want to know what to do about Shvi'it, about prosbul. What's the halacha? Do I follow the Parisha Mishna or the Mishnah Torah? So what's the Rambam's answer?
What we wrote in the Chibur is correct, without doubt. We also wrote this in the Parisha Mishna. What you have is the first version before we checked it.
That is the first version of the Parisha Mishna.
Apparently the editorial right?
Yes. Yeah.
In this matter, we followed what was the author of the Sefer Mitzvot, Rav Chayfetz Ben Yish.
Yes, Leah. Right. This is a relatively obscure now, but at some point relatively influential. We don't know much about him. Probably post-date Sadi Gaon, maybe from Iraq. No one's really sure. We only have a few pages of him. That's for a different night. But anyways, the Rambam is blaming his. Go on.
It is his error.
That is Chayfetz Ben Yatzliach.
He erred by not considering carefully. After we checked what we wrote in the Chibur, and the Chibur became clear, it is correct. We fixed the Parisha Mishna.
Go on.
So too, in that first version of the Parisha Mishna, we fixed many passages. Like in the 10th question that we followed a view of one of the Yonim, then the error became clear. Know this, thus writes Moshe.
Right. So Moshe, that is the Rambam. Right. Who is he blaming his errors on? Other people. Right. I was writing the Parisha Mishnah, the Rambam says, and I followed the views of Chayfetz Ben Yatzliach, who otherwise the Rambam had a certain amount of respect for. Other of the Gaonim, right? The Gaonim for the Rambam just means anyone who basically came before him after the Talmud, not an actual Gaon that is a leader of one of the Gaonic academies in Iraq or Eretz Yisrael, right? But really anybody before him, he's saying all these people, I followed their views, but then I changed my mind and had my own view, right? So this is, we see Rambam telling us that he's blaming his mistakes here on other people, mistakes, right? On other people. And here's two, we see in the same question about Sfichin, right? We have the same kind of comment from the Rambam. Who wants to read source number 7? This is to Rabbi Ephraim Yitzur, who we talked about a little bit last week. Source number 7.
Question 10. What is the meaning of "it should not be consumed" Mishnah be working?
That's the Parisha Mishna at the beginning of the 6th parak of Shvi'it. So what's the answer? The Rambam tells us.
Regarding this Mishnah, we frequently heard its interpretation in the name of Isaac ibn Giyat.
Yeah, in sort of the Shiva world, it's called the Ritzkeas, right? And technically his name is Ibn Giyat, right?
In his book of the Lamb,
right?
Saying that it is the interpretation of all the sages. This is what we concluded. Now that we improved and checked each halacha in our great chibur, the explanation of this Mishnah becomes clear, and its reason was revealed like the reason of Rabbeinu HaKadosh.
Meaning Rabbeinu HaKadosh, meaning Rabbi Nasi, the author of the Mishnah, right? So here you see this Mishnah from this tshuva from the same manuscript. Here you see on the top, Rabbi Ephraim, that's from earlier in the discussion. Right here you see the Rambam referencing the name Yitzchak ibn Riyat in his book, right? And someone later underlined this name. Someone went through as often would happen in medieval manuscripts, people would underline names and books and people just to sort of give people a sense, right? And this manuscript is very important, and because it preserves a lot of the Rambam and other Judeo-Arabic tshuvot that we wouldn't otherwise have copies of, or it's certainly in very, very good version. So anyways, what we see from these two tshuvot and from these two edits to the Parisha Mishna, which are fairly substantive, that the Rambam often would say, the mistake was on other people. I perhaps erred in following them and repeating their views without careful consideration, but later on I went back and changed my mind and offered you my own position. Okay. But what about some other things? Where things get a little more complicated in other cases. So I want to illustrate this through analysis of the Rambam's position on how much of Abelut is D'oraita. Right? There is we all know that in practical halachah, someone sits Shiva for 7 days, right? The question in the Rishonim is how much, if any of that, is a biblical mandate. Okay? So let's just quickly read the Rambam's father's Rebbe's Rebbe, that is the Rif, who the Rif, who taught Ibn Migash, who taught Maimun, the Rambam's father, who taught obviously the Rambam. So the Rambam is very much in line, certainly in dialogue with the Rif on many occasions. So here you see just one of the more important medieval manuscripts of the Rif that we have. That today there's now a critical edition of the Rif that's available on alhatorah.org, an excellent website for anyone looking for careful editions of anything, or really a lot of sources from the Rishonim, not just Parisha Torah, but really a lot of halachic material. Anyways, so let's take a look here at what the Rif says about a debate regarding the length of biblical mourning mandates. So who wants to read source number 8 for us? Who hasn't taken a shot yet?
You see that our teachers held that the 7 days of mourning are D'oraita. They derive this from he performed 7 days of mourning for his father.
Okay, so his teachers meaning the Gaonim. This is a position that's well attested in Gaonic literature. What's the Gaonic position? How much Shiva is D'oraita? 7 days, based on what? Who's that pasuk about? Well, just read it a couple weeks ago. Yosef and Yaakov, right? Exactly, right. The Avot sat 7 days, so too we should sit 7 days. It must be a biblical mandate. This is a complicated problem. We don't have to go into the details as to why the other Rishonim disagreed in general, but we'll just talk about the specific case at hand. The Rif rejects this position. Continue.
This is incorrect because it says explicitly, shall their chata and olah be offered today?
Okay, so this is perhaps a little more obscure pasuk, but it's very important for our discussion. Who says, shall I, right, who says that? Aaron, right? Aaron says after the death of Nadav and Abihu, he says, should I bring their chatat, and should I bring the korbanos? Is that hayitav b'nei Hashem? Right? Is that such a good idea for me to be doing it on the day that my sons have died? That's what Aaron says. So that's the question. So this is the Rif is going to quote this pasuk and add a discussion in Gemara and Tzvachim about this pasuk. Continue.
For me the day is forbidden and the night permitted. For generations both day and night are forbidden. The words of Rabbi Yehuda.
So according to Rabbi Yehuda, right, there's for Aaron, i.e. perhaps maybe the Kohen Gadol, maybe just Aaron himself, right, just the day is Doraita, but the night after the death is Mutter, maybe Derbanan, whatever that might be, and that's for Rabbi Yehuda. The other position,
Shimon says, a minute of the night is not biblical but rabbinic.
Right, so that day day of death, right, the day of death, Aninu is Doraita, the first day, but then evening is then Durabanan, and moving forward after that for the rest of Shiva. Okay, just one more paragraph here.
Since all these Tanaim hold that only the first day is biblical, but it's night, the second night after the death is only rabbinic, and only Rabbi Yehuda holds that the night is Doraita, we do not hold like him, but we follow the majority.
And so now we have two positions, two from the Rishon. The first from the Gaonim, who tell us that Shiva, all Shiva is Doraita in the 7-day sense of Shiva, right? And the Rif, who's telling us, just the first day, right, until sunset of the first day, after the after the day of death, right? No matter what happens, the Aninu is now only rabbinic. Yes, so that's a position that's worked out most strongly by the Balei Tosfos. Absolutely correct. That Aninu and Shiva are perhaps different, but here he's telling us that even Aninu only extends Doraita until the Shkia that first day, and then we switch into a Durabanan mode of Aninu. Absolutely.
Not between the death and the burial.
That is the Rambam position. We'll get there in a second. Okay. So now, just Misfara, right? It makes a lot of sense to think about what is Aninu. Aninu is a sort of tour from mitzvot. A, because you are sort of in shock and meto muta lefanav, right? But B, also because you need to be involved in the burial process, and that exempts you from all other mitzvot, right? So one would think, at least at first glance, that this would be something that would extend until the time of burial, even if that were to be the second day or thereafter, right? That Aninu should extend. And lo and behold, this actually seems to be the Rambam's position. But only at a certain stage. And here, this case is going to be quite complicated. We're going to look at 5 different passages from the Parisha Mishna, 4 of which were edited, right, by the Rambam himself. Okay? So here you see the Parisha Mishna in Ma'aser Sheni, chapter 5, right? Here you see the discussion of Ninut. Here was La'onein, right? And here he has this little Marc, right, which is common in medieval manuscripts from the Islamic world. What it means is that line up and the line to that side means that the writing on the side should be inserted here. If the line was pointing to the other side, then the writing from the other side of the page would have to be inserted there. Okay? So what the Rambam is telling us in this little note, right, is that go to the left-hand side of the page, and you can see that the Rambam turned the page, or maybe he had skills to write sideways. Either way, he wrote like this, and this is where you would put in that text. Okay? So then what we have now is a text that has been edited. Not surprising, but we're going to talk about the content of it here. And here that you have to apologize for a little typo on the second line of the English. But what I want to do here in each of these texts is read them before the edit and after the edit. Okay, just to get a sense of how the Rambam fixed these things, and they'll flow, and each of them will flow to varying degrees. Some of them are a little less. Okay, so someone want to read source number 9 before we get to the part in the parentheses. Just without that, how does that passage read? Who wants to read it for us?
Onain is when he lost a relative that he must mourn.
Right, so an onain is anyone who's chayv to shiva, right? Okay. Then it should say on the day of burial. That's a typo there. On the day of burial, Yom HaKfura. No, without the brackets, just on the day of burial.
Only is he considered an onain.
Right. So what, according to the Rambam now, when is Aninut? The day of burial. Before he gets to the edit, right? You have to just apologize for this typo. It should say on the day of burial, right? On the day of burial, he is considered an onain.
Wait, death means burial.
Yeah, that was my own typo here on source number 9. I apologize for that. On the third word on the second line, on the day of burial, on Yom HaKfura, he is considered an onain. Okay, that's interesting. That's not a sheet that we are generally familiar with. We're mostly familiar with the idea that Aninu is either 1 day, or Shiva is 7 days, or maybe the whole thing is Durabanan. We're not really sure. But this idea that Aninu is connected to burial is a little surprising. Not something we know a lot from the Rishonim. But lo and behold, here it is. And then the Rambam at some point threw in this comment. Who wants to read that sentence? Marc, can you read that sentence again? Both with my correction and the parenthetical phrase.
And Onain is when he lost a relative that he must mourn. On the day of burial, only is he considered an onain.
Oh no, with the yeah.
But Doraita, on the day of death, only is he considered an onain.
So apparently the Rambam changed this aninut on the day of burial to a durabanan, but saying that Doraita aninut is only the first day. Okay, that is a change. That is very interesting and surprising, and something we will see in several other passages in the Parisha Mishna. Here we see,
If you buried the second day.
if you're buried the second day, then it would be the Rabbanan Aninut.
Even though the body wasn't buried.
If the after the first day, it's only the Rabbanan, according to the Rambam, as long even until the time of burial, right? So the question is, originally you said Aninut lasts through burial, right? Up to burial, and the Rambam changed his mind to say Aninut is only Doraita is only the first day, and then.
What would be the practical application of that? The Rabbanan on the second day.
It's a good question. I mean, the Rambam is very interested in this question. Lamaisa, you're still patur for mitzvot. You're saying.
Are you? That's right.
I think so. I'm not a posek, but I think so. Yeah, I think the practical ramification. I mean, for the Rambam, it's very important to know what's Doraita and what's Rabbanan. That's important in and of itself. Whether it has practical application, that's another question.
You don't Doraita.
Apparently,
Well, this man is enough, but maybe for Masrot.
Right, for Kodshim, it's very important, obviously, right, exactly. And that's why these discussions keep coming up in Meiser Sheni and Zvachim, exactly. So for the Kohen, in the Mikdash, it would matter much more than for, Ibizman Hazeh. Exactly. So here you see another quite related correction in the Parisha Mishna in Zvachim in the second parak, right? Here you see some correction, this whole part has been crossed out. So who wants to read? So then we have a text. The original text is with the cross out, and then we have to reread it without the cross out. So someone want to brave reading the Strikethrough feature, which I never use in Microsoft Word. Who wants to read this from the Parisha Mishna, chapter 2 in Zvachim? David? Yep.
One is one who lost a relative that he must mourn. On the day of death only is his own name Yoraita. You don't only read the cross.
No, do read the cross part, because, yeah.
And so, too, as long as he remains unburied, as we explained at the end of Horley.
Right, so therefore he's telling us that until burial, he's Doraita Onin, which is now is consistent with the Rambam's original position. Right? And so what is his proof for why is this relevant? The next sentence.
It is forbidden for him to consume Kodshim as an Onin Doraita, as it says explicitly, and this should happen to me. Shall I consume a chatat today?
Right, exactly. So therefore, we have a nice nafkamina. Doraita, you can't consume korbanos. Right, Doraita originally, Aninu now lasted to burial, but the Rambam changed it only on the day of death. What is the Rambam's proof for the prohibition Doraita of eating a chatat or an ola? This pasuk, Batikrena oti ka'elef ve'achalti chatat hayom. This happens to me, to Aaron, shall I consume a chatat? Okay, so clearly Aaron is saying you cannot consume a chatat on the day of burial or even as long as Aninu lasts. That's how the Rambam is reading this pasuk at this stage, right? And that's going to become important in a second. Then we'll switch to the Parisha Mishna in Demai. Right? We have the exact same thing, only a little more complicated, because the Rambam here, right? If you look at the bottom third here, there's a little line and the correction pointing to the correction. It's a little more complicated here, but basically he has a cross out here, and he has another text here, but this text also he's crossed out and erased, right? So how do we know what this text says? So you can read some of it. Other parts actually derive from medieval copies that were made after he made this correction, before he crossed it out. Okay, so we have the medieval text that preserved this text that's crossed out were then made in this in-between stage, in between stages 1, 2, and 3. Yeah?
When we talk about him changing his mind, how do we know that he didn't, start writing it in the afternoon, then look at it, and just later on in the day do that?
Right, well, because the handwriting is different. So it seems to be a different stage, and it would reflect. Well, I'll show you why I think what the bar is, but it's unlikely. He didn't write all of the Parisha Mishna at once and then correct all these 5 things. I mean, this took time to write this text, right? So correcting it in different places took time as well.
So right. He would write something, and distribute it widely, and then review it.
Yeah.
So why wouldn't, if he made a change, why wouldn't he have the other copies destroyed?
Don't have a chance. I mean, someone comes to you from Syria and says, "I want to copy the Parisha Mishna," right? You say, "Okay, you can copy the Parisha. It's a nice finished work. I'm happy with it. It's all done." And go off, and you never know. And then that person's gone to Syria, and then the copies have been made of that, and copies have been made of those copies, and it's an infinite chain, right?
Maybe, but
you can't communicate with these people.
But it's very dangerous.
Certainly, but what are you supposed to do? That's why he writes his chuvot. He says, he did in some of the cases. He sends the letter to say it's wrong, but you can't. There's only so much you can do, right?
Did he have a scribe sitting there?
Yes, but in this case, it's probably his own handwriting. I can't go through into details of why that is, but probably.
Scribes were writing extra copies.
Yeah, people were copying his works, or people were writing final copies. The fair copy of the Parisha Mishna seems to be his own hand. Okay, let's read one more.
I just have a question.
Yeah.
In those days, if it was considered proper for someone to make a copy for themselves or their friend?
Copyright?
What do you mean?
Yeah, I had a copy of, volume of Parisha Mishna, and my friend wanted a copy, and,
Yeah, I mean, you would share it. I mean, these things were valuable. It was valuable. It took a lot of time to produce. And so you'd be happy, I think, for generally speaking, for people to come and
so
copy.
the attitude is different.
I think so, yeah. Certainly with these manuscripts, the only way it's going to be spread is a ton of work. Right? And this is why it's such a limited circulation. Absolutely, yeah. And this is why we have, it's a puzzle to work backwards and reconstruct all this material. Okay, all right. Okay, let's read the Parisha Mishna in Demai. Let's do this. How are we going to do this? Let's do this without the... so here we see two different crossouts, right? And I've tried to reflect this in the English and the Hebrew, right? The first one was just crossing out the first word, and then he wrote the whole thing, and then he went back and wrote the stuff in the middle. There's 3.5 lines of crossout, whatever it is, and then he crossed that out as well. So it's going to take a few times to read this to get this text. Let's read it slowly just to make sure we're all on the same page here. So let's start with source number 11. Someone want to brave this one for us? Just read the first copy. If it's easier, I'll do it just because it's a little complicated. I'll read this text just because it's a little bit. There's a lot of stages here. So the first version of the Parisha Mishna read as follows: An onain is one who has lost a relative that he must mourn. Right? The Rambam begins all of his discussions almost all the discussions with a similar statement. On the day of death and burial, is he a biblical onain? That's what he said at first, right? And the night after, it's durabanan, right? So the first stage here is very consistent with what the Rambam said. The first stage, right? Day of death and the day of burial, or the day of death from time of death to burial, different positions. And then he went and crossed out the word and burial, and wrote the word only, right? So he said, on the day of death only, after the crossouts, is he a biblical onain, right? At some other stage, he had the following position, right? On the day of death and on the day of burial, he is an onain, doraita, as long as he remains unburied, until the end of that day. But the evening after the day of burial, which is the second day of the burial, he is an onain durabanan, right? So we had various stages here. We're dealing with the question of, is aninut on the day of death, on the day of burial, or the days in between, right? There's a lot of different stages here that are all reflected in the various pictures we have on this manuscript, right? Is that clear? Right? It's a little complicated, but we see there's at least 3 different options here, all of which at the end of the day, the Rambam is coming down and saying, no, only on the day of death itself is one of an onain d'oraita. Okay? Let's go to the fourth cross out here. Do I not have it? Did I forget it? I think there's no slide. Okay, I apologize for that. We have another source, which we don't have a picture of, but I hope you trust me on this. I'm in source number 5 in the Parisha Mishna in Horiot. Okay, someone want to read source number 12 for us in the bottom of page number 3?
We find that Aaron.
One paragraph above that.
We explained several times that Aninus arises just the day of death.
Mm-hmm.
The day of death.
Go on.
And if the deceased remain unburied, he is an onain d'oraisa until burial.
Right, and then he changed that from onain d'oraisa to onain d'rabbanan. Right, so here we have another reflection of the idea that he has changed this idea. Skip down to the next paragraph. We find that Aaron.
We find that Aaron said on the day that Nadab Avihu died, and he was an onain. I mean, Aaron was an onain.
Yeah.
Shall I consume a chatos today? Is this good in God's eyes?
Right.
Only consuming it was a problem for him, not offering it. But for him alone, as a Kohen Gadol has a law, the sons can neither consume nor offer.
Right. So, Ba'achalti chatat hayom hayita b'nei Hashem. What is the diuk the Rambam's making out of this pasuk? Like, how is he reading this pasuk? What's the isser? It's an isser on Aaron to eat, but Aaron is mutter to offer, and that's only the Kohen Gadol. A Kohen Hedyot can neither eat nor offer a korban when he is an onain. Okay? But when we look in the Parisha Mishna in Psachim, we have a little bit of a different picture, right? And here, what's striking in this passage is that we don't have a correction. We'll talk about why in a second. But what does he rule here? And so this is your pictures of the Parisha Mishna in the 8th chapter of Psachim. There's just two passages that I want to go through, and then we'll talk about what this all means. So who wants to read source number 13? This is uncorrected in the Rambam. Yeah?
An Onan is one who lost a relative that he must mourn. Only on the first day is he an Onan Deraisa. And any time the deceased remains unburied, he is also an Onan. So too the day of burial. But this is the Rabbanan.
Okay, so now the Rambam has told us that aninut after the day of death is only rabbinic, right? It sounds to me like this last phrase of Al Midar Rabbanan is added in after the fact, because you read the text without it, right? But there's no evidence from the text itself, right? So I just wonder if this that last phrase is a later interpolation to an earlier text. I don't really know.
Why should you say that?
It seems it's just like it's an explanation of the first sentence.
Yeah, exactly. He's saying the whole thing is rabbinic after the first day. Right, but you could read the text, if you took out the words, but this is the Rabbanan, the text makes sense too, and it would be consistent with the first position of the Rambam. Right?
Well, what you're saying is he didn't do an original version.
I wonder if the draft of the Parisha Mishna Psachim didn't have this words of Al Midar Rabbanan. I'm not sure. That's wondering. But now let's read. Yeah.
If it didn't have last sentences, it was still reading.
So too, but he would say so too the day of burial. It sounds like Doraisa without that last phrase. That's what I'm suggesting. Okay, but the real kicker.
Yeah, because that's what he said. The way he worded it before, the same way.
Yeah. It could be. I'm not sure. Okay, let's.
Your question is he didn't correct this. He didn't have original correction.
Let's go. One more thing. We'll skip two Mishnah out later. He's discussing the same issue. Who wants to read the Parisha Mishna, this source number 14 for us?
Because Anita of the night after the death is Zerabanan, it says in the Torah that it only applies to the day of death, as it says regarding Aaron, on the day that Nadav and Abihu died, shall I consume Nataz today? Is this good in God's eyes?
So here we have the Rambam quoting the same pasuk, right, but learning something very different from it. Ba'achalti chatat hayom hayitav b'nei Hashem. Shall I consume a chatat today? Is that a good idea? Aaron is asking. What is the deal with the Rambam thing? Before he was saying, the Kohen Gadol can be makriv, can offer the korban, but he can't eat it, right? Now he's telling us something else, a different insight from this pasuk. How does he know that aninut is only one day? Because the pasuk says, anyone catch it? Hayom. The Rambam is bringing the same pasuk and having a completely different interpretation of it, a very different lesson, drawing a very different lesson from it. First, he's learning a question of what Kohen Gadol can bring a korban, can eat a korban, and now he's saying, no, it only applies to, the pasuk means just today, right? Just this very day. But there's been a change here, right? Is that change? People see that? Originally, he's reading the pasuk to refer to the korbanot and how the Kohen is supposed to act. Now he's reading it to tell us this final position that aninut only lasts one day. So why is this significant that it is not corrected? So I'm not sure of the answer to this question.
To what? What should be corrected to?
Well, you would think there's no correction here. I would have thought, like the four other parallel discussions here, would have had something in the text and then a change and a later change. But in fact, the Parisha Mishna and Psachim seems to reflect the later date, the later position of the Rambam, that aninut is only one day, don't write it no matter what, right? Even if the burial has not taken place yet. Why is that? I don't know the answer to this question, but I suspect that it might indicate that the Parisha Mishna was not written in exact the order that we have it. Right? And this is a subject for much further research. I don't really have the answer to this question, but I'll show you why I think this, and maybe we'll show one other case why that might be. But I think the fact that this is not a corrected passage indicates that the Rambam had this view, corrected certain pages in the Parisha Mishna, and then only later, after coming to correct it, wrote the Parisha Mishna and Psachim. So this whole idea that the Parisha Mishna, at least my assumption would have been that it was written in order, may have to be torn asunder. Right? We might have to rethink the entire writing of the Parisha Mishna, and perhaps it wasn't written in order, and it may not have been written in that very way. In fact, let's skip this page for a second. If you look in the Parisha Mishna in Makot, this is going to be a very important discussion next week. This is as far as I know, the longest correction on the fair copy that the Rambam made himself. Right here we have an 8-line correction, which is a massive addition to the text of the Parisha Mishna. Right? And here you can see, I've just turned the page 90 degrees so you can see, this actually was written in 2 different stages. Right? Lines 1 through 4 are written in larger font, let's say, and lines 5 through 8 are smaller. Right? So this tells us it was written at 2 different times. Right?
Or that he was writing out of space.
Or these writing out of space, but no, I'll give you more evidence for why that is. If you read this page, this discussion on the bottom of the page, the last line, continues in the middle of a sentence on the side of the page, right? And so when he got to this last line, he started writing the first line in the marginal note, right? And then he finished this at the end of the 4th line. And later came back and added a whole new idea, and you'll see next week why this is a totally new idea, for the second half of this marginal note. Okay? We'll talk about the content of this marginal note next week. But my first question, before we get to the content, is what? Why would you need to do that? I'm reading a book, right? And I have paper I've written on this paper, and I finish the page. I would turn to the next blank page. Why didn't he do that? The only reasonable explanation I can think of is that the page after was already finished. Wait a second. If the text was written in order, why would the next page have been finished? I don't have an answer to this question, but this is another piece, like brick in the wall here that I'm pulling out of the wall in this Jenga structure of maybe the Parisha Mishna was not written in order, and the Parisha Mishna Makot, for some reason, was written after whatever came next.
Did they use bound notebooks, or did they write on separate sheets?
It's a good question. Also, it depended on how some of the pages were. Yeah, so I'm not sure. In this, there's both. The answer is both. The question is, in this case, which one we're dealing with. Then I have to check that. Yeah.
Is it typical the margin would be left empty? So much left space?
Yeah, and you saw the other pages where I didn't give you a full page, but you see, I don't know, you're not going to have time to go back through it, but you can see there's a lot of room in the margins, absolutely. Because it's a big professional work, right? Not like the drafts where you're filling up to the very edges. Yeah.
No, so what I'm amazed is he probably purposely left room for make corrections.
Maybe. I don't think so necessarily.
No, in manuscripts, the Sefer Torah.
Yeah, there's room.
They made room because mice would eat.
You often leave space. That's how everyone would write these things. All the professional manuscripts have room.
No,
not just for corrections.
The old Gemaras had more space. I like that, so I can write my own notes. I'm serious. The new Gemaras go page to page. There's no room for notes.
But the reason they did that was because...
Could be.
Was it written on cloth or papyrus?
Paper. This is paper.
Paper?
Yeah.
Like wood paper, like what we...
Paper we know and love, essentially. Yeah.
Why can't it be simply he had very little to write, one side of the page, it's fresh space.
It's not letter, it's 4 lines. That's not very little.
But he's not going to waste okay.
You're not wasting a page. You're starting the next page with these lines. I mean, as you would with any, tons of discussions go from page to page. I don't know the answer. I don't know. I am just wondering. Okay. The reason that we don't have to. It's after 9, so I don't want to show you this next example. But if you read the sources that I've left at the end of this page here, something else becomes very, very striking. The Rambam, I'll summarize it outside very quickly. The Rambam in the Sefer Mitzvot and the Mishnah Torah is concerned with the question of how many chiyuvei karet is one responsible for if you didn't bring a korban pesach, right? Amazing. So if you have b'mezid, right? So let's say you have 2 opportunities to bring a korban pesach, right? Pesach Rishon, that we all celebrate, Pesach Sheni, right? From the Chumash, right? And the question that the Rambam is interested in is if I don't bring a korban pesach the first time b'mezid, right? But I do bring it the second at Pesach Sheni, do I still get punished for not doing so the first time? No, I was angry at God. I didn't bring the first korban pesach, and then I have to bring it the second. Then I'm like, I do tshuva. I have to bring it the second time around. So in the Sefer Mitzvot, the Rambam has a very strange position that one is even if you do it, even if you brought Pesach Sheni the second time around, if you didn't do it the first time, b'mezid, you're still chayav karet, right? This seems to be a little bit surprising. One would think that Pesach Sheni would be some sort of opportunity to do tshuva. In the Sefer Mitzvot, the Rambam says, no, you could get karet even though you brought Pesach Sheni. Very surprising. The Rambam changed his mind for reasons that I'm not really sure why, but maybe just because it's a difficult position, in the Mishnah Torah. And Avram and Rambam, in this page here, and in this discussion with Daniel Bavli, tells us explicitly the Rambam changed his mind because, the first position is a little surprising. But if you actually read the Parisha Mishna in Psachim, where he discusses this issue, he doesn't address the case head on, but he seems to agree in the Parisha Mishna, uncorrected page in Psachim, with the view in the Mishnah Torah. So if my reading of the Parisha Mishna Psachim Perek Tet, source number 18, is correct, that it aligns with the view in the Mishnah Torah, which is source number 16, we have a funny case here. We have the Parisha Mishna telling us view A, Sefer Mitzvot view B, Mishnah Torah back to view A. Now, why would that be? Could be the Rambam changed his mind twice, but if we already suspect that the Parisha Mishna and Psachim is not written in order, maybe this is further evidence that this whole Masechta, or some parts of it, parts unknown, were written after the fact, right? Later at the Rambam's life. So I don't know the answer to this question. I confess that I'm still, when I have time, I hope to get back to this question in earnest, but this shows me, at least these few cases, show me that the corrections the Rambam made have the potential to sort of rewrite the whole story of the Parisha Mishnah. Right? We tend to, at first glance, I think people will understand, the Rambam wrote the Parisha Mishnah, he wrote drafts, he wrote the fair copy, he corrected it. Right? And then those corrections were aligned with later views. But it could be that the story is a little more complicated than that, and the Parisha Mishnah was not perhaps written in the exact order we might have thought. I don't know the answer to that question, but and I won't know for some time. But I do hope that I've shown you sort of what the kind of insight is that we can show, that put the manuscripts in conversation with Talmud Torah and really gives a new picture of the Rambam and of the Sugyas as they come up. And next week we will turn to some of the cases in the Mishnah Torah and the Sefer Mitzvot for a final complicated problem for how the Rambam works. So just any time for some questions. Yeah, Marc.
Are our vast markets far careful to use the definitive editions?
No. The standard editions of the Parisha Mishnah are based on medieval manuscripts, the ones that are found in the standard Vilna Shas. Right? Those are from translations that were done by different translators over the course of the 13th and 14th centuries, and then made their way to the Vilna Shas through a sort of complicated story. Those were done at different stages. Obviously, those manuscripts that became that printed work were done at different stages of the edit. So some of them have some of the edits, some of them have others.
So that has serious ramifications.
It could be. The text that we rely on, the one who did the expert here is Yosef Kafich, who was the Temani Gadol in the 20th century, and put out these texts with great care. When it comes to the Parisha Mishnah, he had access mostly to this fair copy that the Rambam wrote himself. There's certain things he didn't have access to because they don't exist. Other times, because things were made available to him only after he published, he didn't have access to them. So, for example, in his editions of Avodah Zarah and Horiot, he doesn't have he doesn't use the fair copy. He didn't, for some reason, realize it was available. And Rav Shilat, for example, republished that from the Rambam's own manuscript. So, on my shelf of the Parisha Mishnah, I have Rav Shilat's volume of Horiot and Avodah Zarah right next to it to show you that. When it comes to the Mishnah Torah, we have also, obviously the Rambam made corrections there as well. The best edition also is by Rav Shilat, is available in alhatorah.org. It's rambam.alhatorah.org, and you can see with all his notes, it's pretty amazing. I haven't actually got my hand on the actual physical copy of the book yet, but all the text there, and he tells you the manuscript variants as best he can, and it's pretty reliable, as far as I can tell. When it comes to other works of the Rambam, each one has its own story. Yeah, it's complicated. Yeah. Any other questions about this or what we talked about?
Are you going to discuss next week the controversy over the Rambam and why would you have to?
That's, maybe a little bit. And that's not really related so much to what we're talking about. A little bit. Yeah. It's sort of related to the Abba and Rambam, then Avavli stuff, but we'll see how it goes. Any other? Oh, I don't know. Are there any questions on Zoom? I don't even know. I don't think so. Okay. All right. Okay, so thank you everyone very much. We will see you hopefully next week. And feel free to get in touch with me by email if there's any burning questions about the Rambam manuscripts or any other matters.
It is like the world recognizes Davos.
Yeah, for sure.